guess what we're really talking about here, the common causes of tech disputes. I think ultimately the biggest cause is the one key cause is just communication's not kind of right.
Well, for some types, look, so there are obviously kind of an innumerate number of different types of tech disputes. So if you're a software developer, then things that will be actually important to you might be intellectual property infringement, and that is an entirely different part of technology disputes. If you are effectively a reseller, then kind of supply chain management and contractual disputes around that will probably be pretty important to you as well. But what we're seeing a lot of, and what we're kind of the main things at the moment is effectively around kind of ICT implementations, which have gone a bit awry, and those often have a significant impact on the business rather than just necessarily one product.
Yeah, and so as I said, in relation to those, communication seems to be at the hub or at the centre of what the issues are. I mean, it's not the only thing, but then it kind of manifests itself in a lot of different ways. Obviously, there is a misunderstanding as a result of not being clear at the beginning as to what the expectations are. Communication doesn't happen well during the process. So you've got a poor process of kind of making sure that things that are learned kind of being escalated. And then the last one is oversold, and that's kind of more about somebody not necessarily understanding what it is that they're signing up to at the beginning and buying something more than what they were expecting, or with risks that they didn't understand.
So interestingly, most of the disputes we're seeing these days are not somebody actually stuffing up the kind of the technical side of the delivery. Sorry, it's around those key themes primarily. So the primary one is misunderstanding, and kind of we've got the first bullet point there, which is the customer's always right, which is kind of true. They have the objectives, they want the outcomes, which is fine. And I'm sure a supplier could bend and deliver those outcomes, provided they has the ability to sort of change the project along the way.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I guess the customer is always right. I mean, in a lot of ways, but sometimes the customer will say that we want this, we want this, we want this, but they don't necessarily understand what they need. And the reality is that with any of these kind of things, and we said this in the first session that we presented on, any kind of technology contract is a partnership of a kind. The supplier is the subject matter expert in relation to the technology, but they don't necessarily understand the business and how the business operates and the way in which people interact with that business. The customer, on the other hand, is the expert in the business, but they don't necessarily know and understand how that technology will operate within their business. So the two of them need to actually share information. And so the customer may well come into something expecting an outcome because they've heard that this is what they need, and not fully understand why they're asking for it, but demand it anyhow. Now, if the supplier doesn't actually kind of work through and kind of make sure that they've tested that, they may well end up with an answer that is actually not what was needed by the customer, but what was wanted by the customer. So part of it is, even from the outset, it's not about being brave and saying the customer's not right. It's about making sure that the customer and the supplier are actually on the same page in relation to something, and having those conversations to make sure that we set the project up to succeed from the beginning.
Exactly. And no one wants to hear no, but a bit of a gentle sanity check on the way through is probably pretty advisable.
Yeah.
Another part of another one of the main roles or kind of reasons for kind of tech disputes is that the roles within the project aren't clear, and so that might be kind of the overall structuring. That might be the responsibility of the supplier. That might be the responsibility of the customer, and who's delivering what and how decisions are made.
Yeah, and look, whether you're talking waterfall or agile, there is not a project that the customer can just sit back and say, well, it's all the supplier's responsibility from this point. No matter what happens, there are things, because this is going into a customer's business, so there are things that the customer will need to do as part of that. And so it's about making it clear who has what responsibility and what the risk is of assuming that responsibility. And it becomes that little bit more complex when you start to work in the agile kind of framework, because process is that much more important and there can be a complete misunderstanding there as to who has what role. If you're not careful, the customer can misunderstand that actually the supplier is thinking that they're supplying experts with the systems, but they will be directed by the customer in terms of how to configure this relatively configurable piece of software to meet their requirements, whereas the customer is thinking, actually, this project is being led by the supplier. If the parties are not clear about who is ultimately responsible for delivering that solution, you've again got a project that's being set up to fail. So part of it is about making sure that you understand at the beginning who it is that has what role. And that's really important from a customer's perspective, because they are running their business. And so, they're busy enough as it is. If they are going to pick up the role of kind of driving this project to an outcome, they need to make sure that they've kind of freed up the resource to do that. And if they haven't, again, you have a project that's at risk of being not one that could succeed because the time and attention hasn't been devoted to it.
Absolutely, and that's part of the thing is that often it's around kind of managing internal expectations around the resources that will be needed, the responsibility of the customer internally. Because a lot of times the at least C-suite sort of project sponsors will go, okay, well, we've got you on board, do your job and deliver us what we need, but without actually kind of understanding that they really need to guide that process all the way through.
Yeah, I mean, look, and I think in the first session we talked about data being kind of a large risk with all of these things. And it's that adage that if it's garbage in, it's garbage out. So part of what you have to understand in relation to these things is who is kind of picking up different responsibilities, and data can be one of those things that can be incredibly expensive. You want the supplier to actually make sure the data that is being put into the system is accurate, complete, deduplicated, etc., etc. But on the other hand, if that actually falls as a responsibility for the customer then needs to understand the level of work that they have to actually tidy up their data and have their data reliable so that the system can deliver the outcome that they hope it to have.
Because you can guarantee that kind of if things start going off the rails a little bit, then kind of ultimately it'll come down to, well, I couldn't do my job because there were these dependencies that I needed to undertake, or that the customer needed to undertake, or the supplier needed to take me to do that. So those are that's a significant area of risk that we see. The other two, the next two in that sort of bullet point list, the scale of the job and on the time to evaluate, those two tend to go together.
They do.
And particularly in agile processes, the time that you have those is often lighter, because the idea is that it's flexible and you can work out what needs to happen on the way through. And customers, when they make a decision that they want to implement something, they just want stuff done. So the idea of kind of this sort of kind of time frame to evaluate means that process will be relatively short usually, and that means that often then kind of estimating the scale of the job, and that's both internally and externally in terms of expectations, won't always be as clear or as defined at the outset as it may need to be. Partly problematic is that you will also not necessarily have the time to test kind of assumptions that are made with that evaluation or with the processes that are there. And often when you get into a project, kind of the sort of the business requirements or customer requirements will change, and so that changes the scale of the job.
Yeah, and look, I mean, the reality is to get to that kind of level of certainty that you need, perhaps for a waterfall type contract. There's a lot of work that has to be done up front in terms of scoping and kind of getting into the business, understanding the business, so that you can actually get to a point of the supplier going, yes, I understand the scale of the work that I have to do, and therefore where the end point is. That doesn't necessarily happen in the same way with an agile contract. But at the same time, you need to kind of understand what is the expectations of the customer going into an agile contract in terms of certainty. It's very unlikely that your customer is going to be somebody that is saying, look, we just need the solution. We don't care what the cost is. We don't care how long it takes you to get there. They're going to have some expectations around that. And so there will be this kind of scoping at the beginning. And so there has to be this management of expectation as to the reliability of that information at the beginning that is being provided, and therefore the estimations that are being given at the beginning. Because we've seen in a number of disputes recently that it was a quick and dirty scope at the beginning that the customer had kind of paid for, but that there were lots of kind of caveats around it that the customer hadn't necessarily understood. And so the challenge that you've got is that the two parties have gone into it with a very different expectation as to what the outcome is going to be. As the supplier has got to the point of understanding the scale of the job properly, they've seen that it's going to be much, much bigger, and at that point have been concerned about necessarily upsetting things with the customer, and then things start to go down a path that they could have avoided.
Absolutely.
So that's the challenge that you have, is that not enough time is invested at the beginning to make sure that everybody's on the same page in terms of level and scale and time and effort.
And so we'll touch on it later on, but one of the key things to think about, and this is at the outset when you're kind of setting up the project, but also on the way through, is making sure kind of decisions are documented, everything's documented. So if there are assumptions going in, they should be documented. If there are roles and responsibilities, kind of using the RACI model, kind of those should be very clearly recorded. If there are dependencies which are necessary, for you to continue to meet the project critical path, those should be recorded, and kind of all the way through that should be happening. Because otherwise things go off the rails. And again, we'll get to that in a minute. Now, the kind of the next parts around misunderstanding is both the scale of change and misunderstood, and the ease of accommodating that internally. And look, these are usually ones that fall on the customer side. And so inevitably, well, not inevitably, but often these sort of large-scale tech implementation will come as part of change management within a business. And so a big part of it will be kind of we're scoping this. This is how we want to operate. This is how we're planning to operate. And then so you start building a system or kind of a solution that deals with that objective in mind. And partway through, you find that actually there's a lot of organizational inertia, and you can't actually, the organization can't deliver on that change. And so that will have a material impact on the work that's been done and the objectives of the actual solution itself.
Yeah, and look, we cover this again, and I think one of the things is while we've broken this out into three separate themes under the communication, these all kind of interrelate. One of the key things that can happen is that the people that are involved in the project from the customer side don't necessarily fully understand the way in which things happen within the business. They kind of may have a snapshot in relation to the business, but not necessarily everything. Say for a payroll system, they may kind of believe that there are so many kind of types of worker, and misunderstand that perhaps there's other levels of worker, other kind of arrangements that have been put in place, and don't necessarily capture everything that's needed as part of this process. So part of it is about actually understanding the scale of the change and understanding the way in which that change has to be accommodated. The reality with the new approach to the systems, which is that they're much more standard and need to be configured, is that you end up with a system that will only do certain things. At the edges, it'll be able to accommodate things because that's what it's been designed to do. But it's very much a square peg, and so everybody's got to kind of buy into the fact that there's got to be a square hole there for it to go into. If there's a round hole, then there are problems. And sometimes that customers are kind of understanding that they've got to create that square hole, but they misunderstand the level of work that's involved in getting that hole square.
So that's part. Yeah. So look, that's part of it. Is a big part of this around the communication is making sure the right people are in the right room. And so that's governance, and that's sort of delivery as well.
Yep.
So that's moving on to poor process. So we talk about governance and oversight. As I said, a big part is ensuring that there is are the appropriate voices at kind of various levels of the project structures, because that allows sort of fairly free flowing communication of issues that are necessarily cropping up, or and then changing sort of objectives and sort of outcomes that are required from the business perspective to flow back down fairly seamlessly.
Yeah, look, again, no matter how much scoping you get to do at the beginning, it comes back to the fact that this is a partnership between two parties. One is the subject matter expert on the technology, the other on the business. As they start to work on the project, they start to understand better the other side's perspective in terms of, so that's how your business runs, therefore we're going to need to do this within our system, and vice versa. And so that process will go on, whether it's a waterfall approach or an agile approach. What you have to do is make sure that the information is filtering up to the right level. The risk that you run is if it's all sitting down at the project manager level, that they may not necessarily have all aspects kind of signed off. They may be focused so much on delivering the right features, the right answers, that they kind of lose sight of other things that the business owner sees as critical to it. So it's about making sure that the project managers are talking and kind of realigning things as things are learned, but then also making sure that you have a really good process where that stuff gets escalated, because it may be that you are building the perfect answer. It may be that the users that are involved in kind of creating the stories and that then create the functionality and the features that you're looking for are getting everything that they want, but at the same time you're building the perfect answer, and it's an answer that is going to be too late and too expensive. So part of this is about just making sure that that the right information is being shared at the right level, the right decisions are being made, and everybody that is a stakeholder in this is actually taken on that journey to the end solution.
Absolutely. And another part is actually kind of a fundamental project structuring governance perspective. So where things can often fall down is that a customer will not just effectively contract with one prime and let them sort of sort out everything from there. We see a number of times where a customer will contract with one, possibly two, sort of kind of providers, then also contract with a kind of a software solutions provider directly. And what that can do is that means that it just adds extra layers of complexity and sort of governance issues around kind of who's ultimately responsible for delivery of the system. And if those two systems aren't compatible, what happens? If there are bugs in the underlying solution or kind of the environment that is being hosted in terms of a cloud-based solution is not correct, who is responsible for that? If you've got one prime, that is a very easy process to go, look, you're responsible for this, you sort it out. Otherwise, from a customer's perspective, if you have split this up to save cost or whatever reason, that will almost certainly lead to friction within the process and make it a lot harder to ensure that it's run smoothly.
Yeah, and again, that comes back to that feedback. If there are a number of different parties that are part of delivering this solution, making sure that if something is not quite working the way that it should, that the right parties are talking to each other about that, but then at the same time making sure that that is being escalated so that everybody that is part of this understands. Because two suppliers that are working as part of delivering a solution, if they can come up with a solution between themselves that has ignored exactly what the customer wants, you can still set this up with that, because you can build something that kind of produces information the customer doesn't necessarily want, or it doesn't produce the information in a timely fashion or whatever, but it's a solution that's been developed between two of the parties, but not all of the parties that need to have input into it. So it's about building that process right to make sure that everybody that needs to know knows, and the decisions are made. And then that kind of leads into the next one, which is the decision is made, now let's document it. And I know that sounds a little bit like me trying to create work for myself, but it's not really about that. It's about the process of actually recording the decision that has been made, and then recording that, making sure everybody agrees in relation to that, and now saying that decision has been made. Now, what's the flow and effect on everything else? Does that mean the supplier over here doesn't have to deliver this? Does this mean the supplier has to do things in a different way? And it's going back and then looking at that to make sure that there aren't any unintended consequences as a result of that. And that is not necessarily all about the lawyers getting involved. That's about the technology experts getting involved and saying this system touches on that system, but if this isn't ready by that time, then this has to happen over here. And making sure that all of those things are recorded and that everybody goes, right, yes, we agree, that's the new part.
Again, and decisions that are made, design decisions that are made, kind of assumptions that are made all the way through, dependencies, as Simon said, those are very key. And those documents, doing those things at the time is, from a litigator's perspective, an absolute boom. Contemporaneous documents help me no end. Whereas if there's basically, we had a number of discussions around those, this is what was agreed, but we've literally only got sort of very, very high level sort of minutes of a design meeting, which doesn't touch on those specific decisions or the rationale for them. That is very difficult later on, because if this does end up in court, chances are you will be arguing about that decision that was made probably 3 years prior, which is going to be quite difficult for that. That said, the other thing to think about is not over-documenting things either. So what you can do, particularly in an agile process, is tend to kind of over-document. Basically, people will spend a significant chunk of their time actually covering the butts and so much reporting that they actually do very little of the doing. And all that will do is that will lead to delays and kind of cost escalation as well.
Yeah. And actually, I've seen it can also create that mistrust. You know, covering themselves, just protecting themselves, and so it can have that kind of negative impact in terms of trying to get this project to the end point. But again, the last bullet point on core processes, we've already alluded to, which is you can have all of these conversations, but you've got to get the customer buy-in, and you've got to get the customer buy-in at the right point, and make sure that if you're changing the way in which something is done, that you understand the consequences of that and how that is going to impact on the square hole and the square peg.
Absolutely. And I mean, look, the project team itself, and that might be customer and sort of supplier side, can understand perfectly what is happening and understand exactly how this is going, but there might be an internal disconnect in terms of communication around what that actually looks like. And so it's sort of lost in communication. And then what you get is effectively C-suite going, well, this isn't what we're after at all. Even though the project team for both customer and everybody was delivering what they thought was necessary and what was needed, and that particular relationship was going very well.